Okay, picking up with the story about the cowboy who had to kill his Indian friend. And if you're not familiar with that story, watch the last video. It's at the end of the video. You know, I think now about the situation, about an anticipatory perspective. Had I been the cowboy and saw them at the distance as they were burying the poor souls and watched as the group of executioners stood watch for a long time, would I have used my rifle and shot them earlier from a distance? Assuming that there was no real chance I could overcome the group myself nor outweight the group or other options, what would be the morally correct answer? In fact, I don't know if any of you have seen The Last of the Mohicans, but there's a scene in that movie where the hero shoots one of the good guys as he's being burned alive. You know, was that morally, was that immoral, what he did? I mean, it was sudden, it was deliberate, it was unprovoked, it was violent, but was it merciful? Assuming that there was no real chance that, he could overcome the captors. What would be the morally correct answer? These are complex issues and ones that cannot be decided on the simple words like never and always. Now, before I move on to the next point, we need to be clear about the above. There is no other options. There are no other ways out. There are no other soft choices. And this is what you need to understand. There's no other softer choices. To say there must have been some other way is avoidance, given everything we know about the ancient history of the ancient Near East and the situation. For the husband who has to decide to end the life of his baby, remember that from video 2, I believe. To save the life of his wife, there must be another way, as a bitter fantasy world. For the father who has to pull the plug on his brain-dead child, there must be another way, as a bitter fantasy world. For the daughter who has to administer the lethal medicine to her at death point mother after a long time of waiting and suffering and pain, to say there must be another way is a bitter fantasy world. Sometimes there simply aren't morally neat and tidy and comfortable endings. Now, and very importantly, it should be pointed out, there's no way to avoid the choice. If you were Israel's leadership and you had to destroy the warrior class of males for all the reasons already discussed, then you would be faced with the decision as to what to do with the women and children. And in our case, it was God who said, do it this way. The God who makes the difficult decision about the day and manner of our own deaths for each of us. And it was God who takes no delight in death, indeed, who intends to destroy it, who decided that this was the least painful of all the choices. Okay, now let's address some questions that might pop up from this discussion. First of all, the first question that might pop up is, would this be a carte blanche approval of human euthanasia or mercy killing? Wouldn't this be a direct implication of this event, or at least of our approach in discussing the topic? Actually, this event would not bear on the subject directly, simply because the decider is God. God, of course, is the only agent who bears at least last say authority over death. God bears some kind of governance responsibility for every moment of death. And we know that God sometimes operates in a euthanasia fashion, for his word says so. Isaiah 57, 1-2 says, the righteous perish and no one ponders in his heart. Devout men are taken away and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil. Those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death. Even if we speak of this in some cases, we even speak of this in sometimes in cases of terminal illnesses of loved ones who actually eventually die. We might say God ended their suffering. The scripture generally warrants that this is a choice and decision made by only wise God, a choice that can only safely be trusted to his goodness, wisdom, and authority. Okay, so there's no logical warrant to move from God has the non-derived authority to decide on the moment and circumstances of someone's death, to a human has the non-derived authority to decide on the moment and circumstances of someone's death. Humans are thought to have derived authority for such in selected areas For example, certain forms of capital punishment, some situations of family and self-defense, certain extreme governance situations. Remember the lifeboat ethics scenario I brought up in an earlier video. There are also decisions that have direct consequences in the life and death arena, but they are not in themselves life and death decisions. Many of the difficult scenarios discussed in biomedical ethics fall into this category. So our passage, though, is one in which the decision is taken out of the hands of the Israelites and made explicitly by God, as expressed through his prophet Samuel. Our analysis of this decision here might reveal the euthanasia-like features of his choice, but one could not draw the implication that from these that humans should invariably do the same. That would be a non-secular term. Okay, moving to another question. But if we visualize the horror of this scene, mothers watching children being killed and children watching their mother being cut down, surely this cannot be right. Of course, the scene is horrible, but to see this in the perspective, we would need to, number one, put this side by side with equally vivid and emotionally stirring stories about, for example, the elderly Israelite couple who, after suffering under harsh slavery for 60 years in Egypt, finally escaped miraculously with their grandchild. They gathered their first material possessions they have ever owned, given to them by the Egyptians on the night they left, and are following the main body of Israelites. They are overjoyed by the first experience of freedom and hope for more normal life with their granddaughter, but they are old and the decades of physical abuse have made them weak. So they fall behind the main group of Israelites and they must rest more frequently and longer. As the gap widens, they see the dust cloud behind them, chasing them. They fear that maybe the Egyptians are trying to enslave them, so they jump up in fatigue and anxiety and begin racing towards the Israelites. They are no match for the marauding Amalekites who quickly capture them. They watch in horror as their granddaughter is stripped and evaluated for what price she might fetch on the eastern slave market, with cruel suggestions as to what use she might be to the plantation slave bosses. They see her bound, tied back of horses, where she will have to walk behind the caravan until exhausted and then thrown into a slave cart. They are next. The Amalekites strip them of their clothes, take their few belongings, then cut them down with a sword. Their last images of their granddaughter screaming for help as she is driven by a spear point. And we would need to situate this into a historical landscape of the day in which the size of the objects in the landscape can be seen in relation to one another. In this case, we should note the Amalekite scene examples would have occurred all in one day and involving a maximum of 1,000 to 2,000 families. The above example in number one would have occurred over the space of probably an entire year and involved a couple of thousand, minimum 1.5 million people, the example that I just gave of the elderly couple. And it may have occurred seasonally for over 200 to 400 years and involved easily tens of thousands of families. So from a perspective standpoint, the actions of the Israelites are significantly less magnitude and scale than the anti-Israelite actions of the Amalekites from the standpoint of perspective. If perspective is useful at all, then it is decidedly in the favor of the Israelite response to Amalek.